The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the courthouse, illuminating the polished wooden benches and casting long shadows across the marble floors. The air inside was thick with a mixture of anticipation, tension, and faint traces of coffee and old paper. Courtrooms, typically solemn and formal spaces, often carried a weight that made even seasoned visitors feel small, and today was no different. Lawyers adjusted their ties, flipping through neatly stacked files, while clerks shuffled about, checking schedules and whispering last-minute instructions. The judge's gavel had not yet struck the bench, but already the room carried the unspoken hum of expectation. Among the adults and officials present, one figure stood out, not for attire or posture but for sheer presence. A tiny witness, barely 3 years old, perched on a chair too high for her legs to reach the floor. Her mother crouched nearby, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the other holding a small stuffed bunny. The girl's wide eyes darted around the courtroom, absorbing every detail: the towering shelves of law books, the solemn expressions of the jurors, the officers in uniform standing near the back. She was small, fragile even, yet there was a quiet attentiveness about her that seemed to demand recognition, as though the room instinctively knew that she might become the center of something extraordinary. The crowd murmured quietly, exchanging glances of curiosity and slight bewilderment. Who would bring a toddler into such a serious setting? Some observers whispered among themselves, wondering whether the child was meant to serve as a witness at all, or if she was merely accompanying a parent. Yet there was something about her calm, almost poised demeanor that made onlookers stop and reconsider. She did not squirm, cry, or fidget in the way that most children her age would when surrounded by stern faces and unfamiliar authority. Instead, she clutched her stuffed bunny, her tiny fingers gripping it tightly as though it were both a shield and a bridge to the adult world around her. The judge, a man in his late 50s with a stern face softened by a hint of warmth in his eyes, noticed her immediately. His gaze lingered for a moment, and he allowed himself a quiet smile. In a courtroom dominated by procedure and protocol, there was a certain gravity in recognizing innocence in its form. He had presided over countless trials in his career, from minor civil disputes to high-profile criminal cases, but rarely had he encountered a witness so young. He motioned for the bailiff to approach, who knelt down and whispered instructions to the girl's mother. She nodded reassuringly, then gently lifted the child from the bench beside her. The girl's small feet dangled in the air as she was guided toward the witness stand. Each step she took seemed to echo faintly against the polished wooden floor, a sound almost comedic in its contrast to the seriousness of the surroundings. The murmurs from the gallery softened as spectators tried to catch a glimpse of this tiny participant in the day's proceedings. Cameras discreetly adjusted, some from local news crews and others from courthouse staff documenting the event for records. Even the officers standing at attention seemed to lean slightly forward, curious about what role such a small human could play in a courtroom that normally demanded adult words, careful testimony, and precise recollection. Once she reached the witness stand, the girl paused, looking up at the judge with eyes that seemed too large for her small face. She tilted her head slightly, examining the microphone and the slightly intimidating chair that seemed as big as a throne. The bailiff offered a quiet nod, signaling that she could settle in, and her mother, kneeling beside her, whispered encouragement. The girl's fingers fidgeted with the edge of the stand, tracing invisible patterns across the polished wood. There was a strange, almost magical stillness that fell over the room at that moment. Everyone held their breath, not for tension, as is usual in legal proceedings, but in anticipation of something unexpected. Detective, the officer who had brought the K-9 unit to testify, crouched down slightly to speak to the dog at his side. The police dog, a large German shepherd named Max, tilted its head, ears perked, seemingly sensing the unusual energy in the room. There was a bond between officer and canine that had been cultivated over years of training, but even he could feel the room's attention shift from the legal formalities to the tiny witness who now held the power to capture the collective focus of everyone present. Spectators who had come expecting a routine trial began to exchange glances filled with curiosity and amusement. Journalists quietly whispered into their recorders, scribbling notes about the girl's demeanor, her dress, a soft pink with tiny floral patterns, and the stuffed bunny she held as if it were a talisman. Lawyers, normally so focused on precedent and procedure, found themselves stealing glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the unusual sight. In a place where words were carefully measured and emotions often masked, here was a human presence so pure and immediate that it demanded attention. The courtroom security officers maintained their usual professionalism, but could not entirely hide the small smiles that flickered across their faces. They had seen moments of levity and humanity in court before, but a 3-year-old witness was a rarity. Even the jurors, whose job it was to remain neutral and impartial, found themselves momentarily captivated by the tiny figure before them. It was as if the courtroom had been transformed in an instant, no longer just a place of law, but a stage where innocence, curiosity, and potential impact intersected. As the judge prepared to address the young witness, he leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than usual. "Good morning," he said gently. "Can you help us today?" The girl's lips parted slightly, her expression one of concentration. She looked toward Max, the police dog, and then back at the judge as though weighing her next words carefully. Her tiny hand tightened around the stuffed bunny, and a hush fell over the room. Even those accustomed to tense cross-examinations and heated courtroom debates sensed that this moment would become something remarkable. Behind the scenes, the courtroom staff shared quiet smiles. Court reporters paused in their typing, clerks exchanged soft chuckles, and the bailiff adjusted the microphone, unsure how much a toddler could actually contribute. Yet there was an undeniable electricity in the air, a feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen. In a space usually defined by rules, procedures, and adult authority, a tiny voice was poised to make an impact far larger than anyone could have imagined. The girl's mother whispered softly, offering reassurance without pressure. The child nodded slightly, understanding in her own way that her presence here mattered. She may not have fully comprehended the significance of the trial, the officers, or the courtroom itself, but there was an instinctive understanding that her words, no matter how small, could resonate. The atmosphere in the room, part anticipation, part wonder, was almost palpable. It was a moment suspended in time, where innocence had the power to transcend procedure, where a small figure could shift the energy of an entire space. Detective adjusted Max's leash and gave the dog a quiet command, ensuring that the canine remained calm yet attentive. Max shifted slightly, his nose twitching as if he too sensed the weight of the moment. The other officers, standing near the back, allowed themselves subtle smiles, exchanging glances that conveyed both amusement and admiration. For everyone in the courtroom, from seasoned legal professionals to the casual spectators, it was clear that the day would not proceed as ordinary. Something extraordinary, sparked by the smallest participant, was about to unfold. As the judge cleared his throat, preparing to officially begin the proceedings, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The traditional rhythm of the courtroom, papers shuffled, pens tapped, low murmurs of conversation, paused momentarily. All eyes focused on the tiny witness, perched on the stand, clutching her stuffed bunny, staring intently at Max, the police dog who had been heralded as a hero in local law enforcement circles. There was no precedent for what would happen next, yet there was a shared understanding that everyone present was about to witness a moment that would linger long after the gavel fell. And in that suspended moment, a quiet truth emerged. The courtroom, typically dominated by rules, authority, and adult voices, had become a space where the smallest human could command the largest attention. Here, a 3-year-old had the power not only to witness, but to inspire, to spark reactions that ranged from amusement to admiration, and perhaps most importantly, to remind everyone present that innocence, courage, and honesty could wield an influence far beyond size or age. The courtroom had now fully settled into the rhythm of the trial. The hushed murmurs and shifting of papers had given way to a focused silence, broken only by the occasional cough or the soft scrape of a chair on polished wood. The trial at hand was not one of high-profile crime or sensational scandal, but it mattered deeply to the local community, a case involving a string of thefts that had left residents uneasy and questioning their neighborhood safety. For many, the trial was a reassurance that law and order were being upheld. For others, it was a somber reminder of the fragility of trust in everyday life. Detective, a seasoned officer with years of experience and countless hours working alongside his K-9 partner, Max, rose to deliver his testimony. His uniform was impeccably pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, yet there was a subtle softness in his eyes as they flicked toward the tiny witness perched near the front of the courtroom. Max, a large German shepherd with a coat of sleek black and tan, sat obediently at his handler's side, ears alert and tail occasionally flicking in quiet anticipation. The dog was well known in the community. His training had assisted in apprehending criminals, recovering stolen property, and even locating missing persons. As Detective began recounting the details of the thefts, the courtroom listened intently. He described the incidents in a measured tone, carefully avoiding sensationalism while emphasizing the diligence and skill required in each case. On the night of June 12th, he began, our team responded to a report of a break-in at a local residence. Max and I were called to the scene, where evidence indicated forced entry and a stolen set of valuables. Using his tracking abilities, Max was able to locate footprints leading away from the property and ultimately helped identify the suspect. The jury scribbled notes, the lawyers leaned forward, and the judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the thoroughness of the detective's account. Yet, despite the serious nature of the testimony, there was a subtle undercurrent of warmth in the room, triggered by the presence of the toddler witness. She had not yet spoken, but her wide eyes and intense focus drew glances from nearly every corner of the courtroom. Adults who were typically consumed by procedure found themselves watching her as closely as the evidence being presented. There was something magnetic about her attention, an almost instinctive awareness of the unfolding events that seemed far beyond her years. Detective continued, detailing the meticulous process involved in working with Max. He explained how the canine's keen sense of smell allowed him to follow trails invisible to human eyes, how subtle cues from the dog guided officers to locations of interest, and how years of training had forged an unspoken partnership between handler and K-9. The courtroom, while following along with legal precision, couldn't help but sense the extraordinary bond between man and dog. Max occasionally shifted, his large paws thudding lightly against the wooden floor, as if to remind everyone that he too was part of the story. As the detective spoke, the tiny witness leaned forward slightly, clutching her stuffed bunny a little. She watched Max, her wide eyes reflecting curiosity and something deeper, a fascination with the courage, loyalty, and intelligence embodied by the dog. Even at her tender age, there was a clear recognition that Max was not just an animal, but a hero in his own right, performing feats that demanded respect and admiration. Her gaze flicked momentarily toward her mother, then back to the K-9, as though absorbing every detail, every nuance, every unspoken emotion in the room. The prosecutors, mindful of the courtroom's formality, asked Detective to recount the exact sequence of events leading to the suspect's identification. He described how Max had led officers through narrow alleyways, across uneven terrain, and into a small wooded area behind a row of homes. Max stayed focused, never faltering even as the scent became faint, explained. He tracked tirelessly until we located the suspect hiding in a shed, unaware that he was about to be discovered. The officer's dedication and the dog's precision impressed even the most skeptical jurors, who nodded quietly at the demonstration of teamwork and skill. Throughout the testimony, the tiny witness maintained her attention. Her mother watched her closely, marveling at how the girl seemed to grasp the importance of the situation, even if only on an intuitive level. The courtroom staff, lawyers and spectators, all hardened by routine and procedure, could not ignore the juxtaposition of innocence and seriousness, a dynamic that made the trial unexpectedly poignant. Here was a child, too small to fully understand legal jargon, yet fully capable of absorbing the essence of courage and justice through observation alone. The defense attorney, nodding the attention the toddler commanded, attempted to maintain focus on procedural arguments, questioning the accuracy of certain evidence and the reliability of witness recollections. Yet even he paused occasionally, his eyes catching the small figure on the stand. There was an undeniable charm, an innocence so compelling that it briefly diffused the adversarial tension typically dominating the courtroom. For a moment, even the most hardened lawyer found himself reconsidering the impact of empathy and human connection, alongside strict legal reasoning. As the morning progressed, Detective was asked to describe specific instances where Max's intervention had directly prevented further harm. He recounted a night when a neighbor had been attempting to flee the scene of a burglary, only to be intercepted thanks to Max's keen tracking. "Without him," said solemnly, "the suspect may have escaped, and the stolen items would likely have been lost forever. Max's role is invaluable, not just as a tool but as a partner." The room absorbed this statement in silence, each individual recognizing the gravity of a partnership built on trust, training, and instinct. Meanwhile, the tiny witness's attention never wavered. She occasionally leaned closer to her mother, whispered questions about Max's fur, his ears, and his tail, or simply watched with rapt fascination. Her engagement, though quiet and unobtrusive, was a reminder to everyone present that perception and understanding were not limited by age. Even at 3, she could sense heroism, loyalty, and the weight of responsibility, as if instinctively acknowledging that the courtroom was a stage where courage, human or canine, could leave a lasting imprint. Officers sitting nearby exchanged quiet smiles, impressed by her presence. They had spent years teaching Max commands, ensuring he remained calm under stress, and now they observed that their K-9 partner seemed equally affected by the child's curiosity. Max's posture relaxed slightly, ears flicking toward the girl as if recognizing her silent admiration. In that moment, the courtroom transformed into something more than a place for legal proceedings. It became a shared space of observation, appreciation, and subtle emotional connection among all participants. By mid-morning, the flow of the trial had settled into a rhythm where facts were presented, questions posed, and the narrative of theft and recovery unfolded in meticulous detail. Yet through it all, the tiny witness remained a focal point, reminding everyone that law and order were ultimately about people and community. The stolen property, the suspect's capture, and the K-9's heroics were not just procedural milestones. They were stories of courage, empathy, and connection, rendered all the more vivid by the presence of an innocent observer whose attention lent a unique perspective to the proceedings. As Detective concluded his testimony, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. The story of Max's heroics had been told with clarity, precision, and respect, but it was the silent witness, the 3-year-old girl, who had subtly reframed the narrative. In observing her reactions, wide-eyed fascination, quiet engagement, and instinctive respect for the dog, spectators and officers alike were reminded that heroism is not just about action, but also about recognition and appreciation. The courtroom, normally dominated by adult voices and legal technicalities, had been transformed by a tiny presence capable of inspiring awe. The judge cleared his throat and glanced down at the girl. "You've been very attentive today," he said gently. "Sometimes, observing is just as important as speaking." The words seemed to resonate beyond the literal meaning, highlighting the subtle impact that quiet witnesses, no matter how young, could have on those around them. The jury, the lawyers, and the courtroom staff all reflected momentarily on the rare combination of innocence and attentiveness that had permeated the space, realizing that the trial's narrative had expanded beyond the events themselves to include the unexpected influence of a tiny observer. By the time the morning session ended, the story of the case, the thefts, the investigations, and the K-9's heroism had been laid bare in detail. Yet what lingered most vividly in the minds of those present was not merely the procedural elements, but the presence of the 3-year-old witness. She had quietly observed, processed, and connected with the narrative in a way that commanded attention, reminding everyone that understanding and empathy could emerge in the smallest of forms. Her presence had added depth, warmth, and an unspoken humanity to a trial that otherwise might have remained strictly procedural. And so, as the courtroom emptied for a brief recess, whispers of admiration, amusement, and quiet reflection filled the hallways. The tiny witness, clutching her stuffed bunny and walking hand in hand with her mother, had already begun to make an indelible impression. She had not spoken a single word yet, but her attentive presence alone had altered the energy of the room. In the world of law and procedure, where adults often dominate the narrative, a 3-year-old had reminded everyone that observation, curiosity, and silent acknowledgement could be as impactful as testimony itself. The courtroom had settled into a steady rhythm by late morning. Papers shuffled softly, the judge's gavel occasionally tapping to maintain order, and the murmur of whispered conversations subsided into a focused hush. The trial was proceeding as expected, or so it seemed. Yet all attention continually returned to a single, unusual figure, the tiny witness. She remained perched on her oversized chair, clutching her stuffed bunny with a grip that suggested both comfort and quiet determination. Though only 3 years old, there was something about her presence that demanded attention, a kind of understated authority granted by innocence itself. Her mother, seated at the front row, whispered softly words of encouragement. "You can do this, sweetie," she murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind the girl's ear. The child nodded, understanding in the limited, instinctive way that toddlers do. She may not have fully comprehended the complexities of legal proceedings, evidence chains, or testimonies, yet she sensed the importance of this moment. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom, jurors, lawyers, officers, spectators, seemed to hover on her, waiting for what she might say or do. The judge, a man who had presided over hundreds of trials in his long career, leaned slightly forward, lowering his tone to one of warmth rather than formality. "Are you ready to tell us what you know?" he asked gently. His question was more than procedural. It carried a quiet invitation for participation, an acknowledgement of the girl's potential to influence the proceedings simply by being present. The courtroom, attentive yet hushed, seemed to hold its collective breath, as if understanding that the tiniest voice could make the loudest impact. Carefully, the bailiff guided her toward the witness stand. Each step she took made a soft thud against the polished wooden floor, tiny feet seemingly oversized by the long strides of the adult escort. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, craning their necks to catch a better view. Journalists discreetly adjusted cameras, noting her focused expression, the stuffed bunny clutched tightly against her chest, and the way she paused mid-step to glance at Max, the police dog. The large German shepherd's ears twitched slightly, as if recognizing that a new form of attention had entered the room. The judge gestured for the child to take her seat on the witness stand. She looked up at the towering chair and the microphone, her small fingers brushing the polished wood as if testing it. The stuffed bunny remained clutched in her other hand, a source of comfort and courage. A faint smile flickered across her face as she glanced at her mother, receiving an encouraging nod. She then turned her attention to Max, her eyes wide with curiosity and recognition. The dog, sensing the child's energy, sat calmly, tail flicking occasionally, ears tilting toward her in silent acknowledgement. Detective knelt slightly beside Max, ensuring the dog remained calm and attentive. He exchanged a brief, knowing glance with the judge, both silently acknowledging the unusual circumstances of the moment. While the detective's testimony had already painted Max as a hero in the eyes of the courtroom, the tiny witness's forthcoming participation would elevate the narrative from a procedural retelling to something more human, more emotionally resonant. The audience seemed to sense it, leaning in as if expecting the unexpected. For the girl, the experience was both thrilling and intimidating. The courtroom was enormous from her perspective, full of towering adults whose voices often seemed too loud, too serious. Yet her curiosity overpowered any trepidation. She shifted slightly on the chair, ensuring her feet did not dangle too precariously, and then focused on Max. She studied his sleek coat, his alert eyes, and the way he sat perfectly still despite the attention of the room. In that instant, the child seemed to understand, not intellectually but instinctively, that this dog was more than an animal. He was a hero, a partner, and a symbol of safety for the community. The murmurs from the gallery had quieted to an almost reverent silence. Even the usually stern jury members leaned forward slightly, their expressions softening. Lawyers, reporters, and spectators who were accustomed to the dryness of legal proceedings were captivated not by legal arguments, but by the unexpected dynamic unfolding before them. It was as if the courtroom had temporarily shifted from a place of procedure to a stage where innocence, courage, and quiet observation were commanding the narrative. The bailiff whispered a final word to the girl, adjusting the microphone to her height. "You can speak now," he said gently. The child's tiny fingers fidgeted with the edge of the stand, tracing invisible patterns across the wood as she prepared herself. Her mother offered a reassuring nod, encouraging her without pressure. For the audience, the moment was charged with anticipation. No one knew exactly what she would say or do, but everyone sensed that her actions, even silence, carried weight. Finally, the girl opened her mouth. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, yet clear enough to carry across the courtroom. She spoke not in complex sentences or legal terminology, but in simple words that immediately captured attention. "Dog," she said, pointing toward Max, her wide eyes reflecting awe and curiosity. The courtroom paused, a collective breath held as the simplicity of her observation created an unexpected pause in the proceedings. Adults smiled quietly, some stifling laughter, others struck by the clarity and innocence of her recognition. Encouraged, she continued, speaking in the halting, tentative cadence characteristic of a toddler yet imbued with unmistakable focus. "Dog hero," she added, her voice gaining confidence with each word. Max's ears twitched, his tail flicking in subtle acknowledgement. The courtroom reacted almost instinctively. Officers exchanged quiet smiles, the judge's stern expression softened into one of warmth, and even the journalists found themselves momentarily distracted from their recording devices, captivated by the unfolding human drama. Detective leaned slightly forward, offering quiet reassurance to both the child and the dog. "Yes, Max is a hero," he murmured, his voice calm yet tinged with pride. The simple affirmation seemed to empower the girl further. She looked up at Max as though assessing whether he approved of her judgment. The dog remained still, yet attentive, ears forward, eyes fixed on the tiny witness. There was a silent communication between them, a moment of connection that transcended words and reminded the courtroom of the profound relationships that could exist between humans and animals. The spectators' reactions grew more pronounced, though still subdued out of respect for the trial. Smiles spread, whispered comments of admiration circulated, and a sense of shared warmth filled the space. It was an unusual moment, blending the gravity of legal proceedings with the charm and sincerity of a child's observation. In a room dominated by facts, evidence, and protocol, the toddler's simple words had injected humanity, humor, and a genuine sense of wonder. Even the defense attorney, who had been prepared to challenge every detail of detective's testimony, paused. His eyes caught the tiny witness, and for a moment, his focus shifted from procedural arguments to the human element before him. He allowed himself a brief smile, recognizing that the narrative had expanded beyond the case itself to include the impact of this small, brave participant. The courtroom, normally so predictable and formal, had been subtly transformed by her presence. The judge, noting the reactions of the audience and jurors, spoke again with quiet authority. "Thank you for observing so carefully," he said. "Sometimes, paying attention is just as important as speaking." His words acknowledged the child's participation while reinforcing the seriousness of the proceedings. Yet beneath the formality was a genuine recognition that the smallest witness had already influenced the atmosphere, inspiring engagement, curiosity, and warmth throughout the room. For the girl, the experience was both empowering and grounding. Each observation she made, each word she spoke, seemed to create ripples across the courtroom. Max remained a constant focus, a tangible symbol of heroism and dedication. She had no concept of the trial's technicalities, yet she intuitively understood her role as an observer, a witness, and in a way, a participant capable of influencing the energy and tone of the proceedings. By the time the mid-morning recess approached, the courtroom had absorbed the presence of the tiny witness into its narrative. The trial itself, the thefts, the police investigations, and Max's heroics remained the central focus. Yet now, overlying the factual proceedings was a human element that could not be ignored: the awareness, curiosity, and quiet impact of a child who had stepped forward, observed carefully, and begun to communicate her recognition of bravery and dedication. Spectators whispered softly to one another as the recess began, commenting on the child's composure, intelligence, and charm. "She's remarkable for her age," one juror remarked under her breath. "And the way she interacts with the dog, it's almost like she understands his courage instinctively." Even the officers, who were accustomed to public praise for Max, seemed touched by the mutual recognition between the child and the dog. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that this interaction had created a story within the story, an emotional layer that enriched the entire trial experience. As the girl returned briefly to her mother's side, she hugged her stuffed bunny tightly, her eyes reflecting both excitement and wonder. She had stepped forward, observed, and begun to participate in a way that transcended age. In the formal, structured environment of the courtroom, where every word was weighed and recorded, her presence reminded everyone that observation, empathy, and genuine human connection were as vital as testimony and evidence. And in that moment, the courtroom itself seemed to recognize the magnitude of what was unfolding. What began as a routine trial had transformed into an experience that blended law, heroism, innocence, and human connection. The tiny witness had stepped forward, not only to observe but to influence, not only to participate but to inspire, and in doing so, she set the stage for a moment that no one would soon forget. The courtroom had settled into an unusual rhythm, one that blended tension with anticipation, seriousness with the quiet charm of the tiny witness. Every adult, from the judge to the attorneys, the jury members, and the spectators, had shifted their attention from the procedural details of the trial to the little girl perched on the witness stand. She had observed carefully, her wide eyes tracking every movement, every expression, and every subtle cue in the room. But now, the moment everyone had been waiting for, the point at which her presence might create something entirely unexpected, was approaching. Max, the police dog, sat obediently at Detective's side. His ears twitched, tail flicking ever so slightly, and his eyes seemed to follow the girl's every motion. There was a quiet understanding in the air, a sense that the bond between child and canine had already begun forming in ways no one could fully articulate. Officers whispered quietly to one another, impressed by the subtle interplay unfolding before their eyes. Even the judge's stern features softened slightly, revealing a trace of curiosity and warmth. The bailiff, understanding that this was the pivotal moment, knelt near the girl, adjusting the microphone to her height. "Whenever you're ready," he said softly, "you can tell us." His tone was gentle, inviting rather than commanding. The girl's fingers fidgeted nervously with the edge of her stuffed bunny. She inhaled, small chest rising and falling, eyes darting between her mother, the dog, and the polished wood of the stand. She seemed to measure the gravity of the room, aware, though only instinctively, of the attention that now rested solely on her. Then she spoke. Her voice was small at first, almost tentative, yet carried an unmistakable clarity. "Dog name," she said, her eyes fixed on Max. The courtroom paused. Adult spectators, conditioned to the weight of legal proceedings, instinctively leaned forward. Lawyers froze mid-note, jurors exchanged surprised glances, and officers glanced at one another with quiet smiles. The simplicity of her words held the room captive. A 3-year-old was about to do something extraordinary in a space usually dominated by adults and formalities. Encouraged by the attentive silence and gentle nods from her mother, the girl took a small breath and continued, her words gaining confidence. "You hero," she declared, pointing toward Max. The courtroom reacted instantaneously. There was a brief, stunned silence, followed by a ripple of quiet laughter, smiles, and soft applause. It was as if the room collectively recognized the brilliance of the moment. A toddler, with her unfiltered honesty and pure perspective, had just named a police dog in court. The act was both charming and profound, a simple gesture that resonated far beyond its immediate context. Detective, momentarily stunned, crouched slightly to scratch Max behind the ears. "Looks like hero suits you," he murmured, a mixture of pride and amusement in his voice. Max responded with a single, measured bark and a small wag of his tail, as if acknowledging the name and approving of its significance. The officers exchanged quiet chuckles, nodding that the nomming had humanized the canine hero in a way no official announcement ever could. The dog, trained for precision and obedience, had just become a symbol of courage and loyalty in a more personal, heartwarming sense. Spectators in the gallery whispered softly, exchanging comments about the girl's courage and clarity. "Can you believe she's only 3?" one juror whispered. "And yet, she just named him perfectly." The tiny witness's innocence had injected levity, warmth, and humanity into a space usually defined by seriousness and procedure. Even the defense attorney, prepared to focus solely on evidence and legal arguments, allowed himself a small smile. The courtroom had shifted from a venue of argument and debate to a shared space of admiration and human connection. The girl, emboldened by the room's reaction, leaned slightly forward and added a few more words, her small voice carrying with remarkable clarity. "Hero brave," she said simply. The words resonated across the courtroom, drawing subtle nods from jurors, smiles from officers, and a glance of pride from her mother. It was an extraordinary combination of innocence and insight. A child's instinctive understanding of bravery, loyalty, and admiration had captured the essence of Max's role in the community. The courtroom seemed to pulse with a new energy, a mixture of warmth, amusement, and genuine respect. The judge, who had observed the interaction with growing fascination, addressed the tiny witness directly. "That's a wonderful name," he said warmly. "Do you know why?" The girl shook her head slightly, her gaze fixed on Max, who responded with a subtle wag of his tail. "Because he helps people," she replied, her voice soft but certain. The courtroom collectively exhaled, recognizing that her simple reasoning had captured the essence of law enforcement's relationship with the community. The name hero was not just cute, it was meaningful, a reflection of courage, service, and loyalty distilled into the perspective of a child. Officers, who were usually stoic and reserved, exchanged brief smiles and nods, clearly touched by the moment. Max, now officially hero in the eyes of the tiny witness, had transformed from a trained law enforcement tool into a living symbol of hope, bravery, and community service. Detective whispered quietly to his colleagues, "Sometimes the smallest voices remind us why we do this work." The officers, nodding the child's courage and perception, nodded in agreement. The courtroom's atmosphere, once dominated by procedural rigidity, had softened into a collective recognition of something deeper. The gallery of spectators, many of whom had been skeptical of a toddler's relevance to the trial, found themselves captivated. Phones were discreetly lowered, cameras adjusted, and all eyes focused on the interaction between child and dog. Some whispered words of admiration, others simply smiled quietly, appreciating the spontaneous, unscripted moment. The energy in the room had shifted from anticipation to reflection. Here, in a space defined by rules, testimony, and legal procedure, the power of innocence and observation had claimed center stage. Even the court reporters, typically immersed in their meticulous record-keeping, paused briefly. The sound of keys tapping slowed, then stopped altogether as they absorbed the significance of what was happening. Every observer recognized that this was not merely a charming anecdote. It was a meaningful, unplanned moment in which a child's perspective illuminated qualities of bravery, loyalty, and service in a way that formal testimony alone could not. The courtroom had become a space for both justice and shared humanity. Max, now hero, shifted slightly, leaning toward detective, his eyes alert but calm. The child extended her small hand toward him, brushing her fingers along his sleek coat. The gesture was tentative, respectful, yet imbued with an innate understanding of connection. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath again, witnessing the silent bond forming between a 3-year-old and a canine hero. It was a moment that transcended words, a subtle affirmation of the values that underpinned the trial itself: courage, service, and the quiet power of empathy. The judge, sensing the profound impact, paused the proceedings briefly. "Let's take a moment," he said, his voice soft but carrying authority. "Sometimes recognition is as important as testimony." The courtroom collectively relaxed, acknowledging that this brief interlude had enriched the trial far beyond its procedural elements. Spectators exchanged soft smiles, officers shared quiet glances, and the jurors seemed unexpectedly moved by the unspoken significance of a child's observation and nomming of the K9 hero. The tiny witness, encouraged by the warmth and attentiveness of the room, added one final flourish. "Hero helps everyone," she said, her voice strong and deliberate. A wave of soft applause rippled through the courtroom, hushed yet unmistakable. The words had captured the essence of Max's role, distilled into a perspective so pure that it resonated more powerfully than any adult testimony could. The courtroom had witnessed something rare, a moment in which innocence, insight, and empathy converged, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. Detective knelt again to whisper quietly to Max. "You're officially hero now," he said, patting the dog's head gently. Max responded with a calm, dignified wag of the tail, as if acknowledging the honor and responsibility bestowed upon him by the smallest yet perhaps most insightful observer in the room. Officers exchanged soft smiles, understanding that the child's simple act of nomming the dog had humanized the proceedings, creating a shared story of courage and admiration that would be remembered far longer than any legal argument presented that day. The gallery continued to murmur softly, capturing the story on smartphones and exchanging looks of quiet awe. Social media influencers among the reporters quickly noted the moment's potential for virality. Yet even without amplification, the impact within the courtroom was undeniable. Adults who had arrived expecting routine procedural observation were leaving with an indelible sense of warmth, wonder, and appreciation for the smallest voice that had spoken so boldly. As the judge prepared to resume formal proceedings, he offered one final comment. "Sometimes, wisdom comes from unexpected places," he said, smiling gently at the girl. "Thank you for reminding us of that today." The tiny witness beamed, her small face lighting up with a sense of accomplishment. For the courtroom, the act of nomming hero had transformed the day, infusing it with humanity, charm, and a sense of collective joy that no legal argument could replicate. And so, in that quiet, extraordinary moment, the courtroom had witnessed a phenomenon that would be retold for years to come. A 3-year-old, armed with nothing more than honesty, courage, and a perceptive heart, had given a police dog a name. That simple act resonated far beyond the immediate proceedings, symbolizing bravery, loyalty, and the unexpected ways innocence could impact a serious, adult world. The courtroom had barely settled after the toddler's declaration when the first subtle reactions among the law enforcement team began to ripple through the space. Officers who had been trained to maintain stoicism in the face of tension now found themselves smiling, exchanging knowing glances that acknowledged the extraordinary moment they had just witnessed. Max, now officially hero in the eyes of the tiny witness, shifted slightly, his posture alert yet calm, as if understanding that he had been given a name that carried meaning far beyond his role as a trained K-9. Detective knelt beside Hero, patting the dog's head gently. "You've earned that name," he whispered, a quiet mix of pride, amusement, and humility in his voice. His colleagues, standing nearby in uniform, exchanged soft chuckles and subtle nods. In the usually rigid hierarchy of law enforcement, this small, unscripted moment had broken through the usual professional veneer, reminding officers of why they had chosen this line of work in the first place: service, bravery, and the human, and sometimes animal, connections that made the effort meaningful. Officer Martinez, who had trained with Hero for over 3 years, leaned in slightly, shaking his head in quiet amazement. "I can't believe it," he said softly too. "A 3-year-old just summed up everything we try to teach him in one word: hero." The words hung in the air, reverberating with a truth that went beyond legal definitions, beyond training protocols. The nomming had humanized the dog, elevated the child's role in the trial, and bridged the gap between authority and innocence in a way that textbooks, lectures, or reports never could. Max, Hero, responded to the subtle praise with a gentle tilt of his head, his ears flicking toward the officers. There was an almost imperceptible recognition in his gaze, as though he understood the significance of the act that had just occurred. The officers smiled, some quietly laughing at the dog's dignified, unassuming demeanor. For all the hours spent in training, obedience drills, and field exercises, this moment was unplanned, unscripted, and yet far more impactful than any official commendation or press release. Lieutenant Daniels, standing near the back of the courtroom, observed the interaction with a mixture of pride and quiet emotion. She had witnessed countless ceremonies, commendations, and official recognitions over her career, yet nothing compared to the authenticity of this moment. A child's voice had, in one instant, conveyed recognition, admiration, and understanding in a way that adults sometimes struggled to articulate over years of training and experience. Daniels leaned toward her colleague, whispering, "It's remarkable. Sometimes the smallest voices leave the biggest impact." The officers' reactions extended beyond smiles and whispers. Several reached instinctively toward Hero, offering gentle scratches behind the ears or soft pats on the flank. The dog, conditioned for calm and obedience under stress, remained composed yet responsive, his tail flicking subtly with satisfaction. In that small physical exchange, the officers and Hero shared a humanizing moment, a reminder that law enforcement, often perceived as rigid or detached, was composed of individuals capable of empathy, warmth, and genuine appreciation. Detective reflected quietly on the moment, his mind returning to earlier nights of long shifts and challenging cases. He thought about the times Hero had tracked suspects in rain, snow, or darkness, the countless hours spent building trust, obedience, and teamwork, and the unspoken bond they had developed. Yet he realized that no matter how extraordinary Hero's feats were in terms of skill and training, the recognition from a child, a simple acknowledgement of bravery and heroism, was far more meaningful in its emotional impact. It was validation from an audience untainted by expectations, protocol, or hierarchy. Other officers began to share quiet smiles and soft comments among themselves. "She nailed it," whispered officer, who had assisted in several of Hero's cases. "One word, and she captured everything we feel about him: loyalty, bravery, service." It was a shared understanding that the nomming had transcended the courtroom, It symbolized the culmination of years of dedication and the inherent respect for the dog's contributions. In a space where praise is often formal and measured, this spontaneous moment carried authenticity that no official commendation could replicate. Even the K-9 handler team, who had been responsible for Hero's rigorous training, expressed subtle emotions. They had worked tirelessly to instill obedience, resilience, and focus in the dog, yet the child's nomming struck a chord far deeper than any technical achievement. There was a sense that Hero's role had shifted in the collective imagination. He was no longer just a trained police dog, but a symbol of courage, community service, and inspiration. And this recognition, bestowed by a tiny, unassuming observer, resonated with a purity the officers hadn't realized they craved. The courtroom's atmosphere, though still formal, subtly transformed in the wake of the nomming. Officers relaxed their posture, leaning slightly toward one another in quiet camaraderie. Smiles replaced stoic expressions, nods acknowledged unspoken appreciation, and the dog's calm composure served as a grounding presence. For the first time in weeks of preparation and months of routine work, the officers felt a shared sense of emotional connection, not only with Hero, but with the human dimension of their duties, embodied in the perceptive gaze of a 3-year-old witness. The judge, observing the subtle changes in demeanor among the law enforcement personnel, allowed a small pause before resuming the trial. He recognized that this moment carried significance beyond legal procedures. It was a shared human experience that reinforced the values underlying the justice system: courage, integrity, and empathy. By acknowledging the nomming, even silently, the judge honored the unique intersection of innocence and heroism that had transformed the courtroom into a space of warmth, reflection, and quiet joy. As the courtroom murmured with hushed admiration, officers discreetly exchanged anecdotes about past incidents involving Hero. Detectives shared a brief story about a nighttime pursuit where Hero's tracking abilities had prevented a theft from escalating into violence. Officer Martinez mentioned a case in which Hero had located a missing child in a wooded area, demonstrating patience, focus, and dedication beyond what words could describe. These recollections, shared quietly among the officers, underscored the child's insight. She had instinctively recognized not just Hero's presence, but the essence of bravery and commitment that defined him. The interaction also inspired a subtle, collective reflection among the law enforcement team. For years, they had worked under immense pressure, often facing criticism, danger, and the monotony of bureaucratic procedures. Hero's recognition by the tiny witness reminded them why their work mattered, not for accolades or reports, but for the real, tangible impact on people's lives. The act of nomming was not just symbolic. It was a reaffirmation of the human element in their profession, a reminder that their efforts resonated far beyond procedural measures and technical reports. Even as the trial continued, the energy among the officers remained heightened. Hero sat alertly, occasionally glancing toward the child who had given him his new identity. There was a subtle, almost spiritual understanding in the room. Bravery, dedication, and service could be recognized in ways that transcended age, hierarchy, and formality. The officer's pride in Hero deepened, not just because of his abilities, but because the tiny witness had validated them in a manner both pure and unfiltered. Lieutenant Daniels, nodding the emotional resonance, leaned toward Detective. "Moments like these remind us why we do this work," she said softly, nodded, eyes fixed on Hero and the child. "Exactly," he murmured. "It's not about reports, stats, or commendations. It's about courage, connection, and the lives we touch. And sometimes the simplest gestures carry the deepest meaning." The officers, quietly listening, seemed to absorb this insight, the collective impact of a tiny witness's perspective crystallizing into renewed pride and humility. As the trial progressed, Hero's newfound name became a point of subtle celebration among the officers. Informal remarks circulated. "Hero's on duty," whispered one. "Looks like he's earned a promotion," joked another quietly. Even the detectives who were normally reserved allowed themselves soft smiles, appreciating the balance of levity and significance brought by the child's act. What began as a simple nomming had evolved into a moment of shared recognition, bridging professional dedication and personal emotion in a courtroom that rarely witnessed such displays. Max, still seated calmly, occasionally looked toward the tiny witness as if seeking reassurance. Her eyes met his in brief exchanges, reinforcing the unspoken connection that had formed between them. Officers noted these interactions silently, understanding that the dog's composure and responsiveness reflected the mutual respect and acknowledgement granted by the child. In a profession often governed by rules and protocols, such genuine, instinctive connections were rare and deeply meaningful. By the end of the morning session, the reactions of law enforcement had become a subtle narrative of their own. Quiet smiles, exchanged nods, whispered remarks, and gentle gestures toward Hero revealed a dimension of their humanity rarely seen in formal proceedings. They had witnessed, in real time, the power of innocence, recognition, and connection. A 3-year-old had managed to inspire admiration, joy, and renewed pride in officers accustomed to structure, authority, and procedural rigor. Even detective reflected inwardly on the significance. Years of training, fieldwork, and challenging missions had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing compared to this unplanned, unscripted moment. Hero's bravery had been validated, not by awards or commendations, but by a child's unfiltered, insightful recognition. And in doing so, the courtroom had become more than a space of law. It had become a space of shared human experience, warmth, and inspiration. And as the officers resumed their professional composure, their eyes occasionally drifting toward Hero and the tiny witness, it became clear that this moment would linger far longer than the trial itself. A child's voice had reminded seasoned law enforcement personnel of the reasons they committed themselves to service, courage, loyalty, and the profound impact of human and canine connections. In a space defined by procedure, formality, and rules, the tiniest participant had sparked a ripple of humanity, pride, and emotional resonance that would not soon be forgotten. By the time the courtroom recessed for lunch, whispers of the tiny witness's remarkable act had begun to travel beyond the polished wood and marble walls. Within minutes, reporters who had been discreetly observing the proceedings began contacting their news desks, crafting stories that balanced factual reporting with the extraordinary human interest angle that had just unfolded. The story was simple yet irresistible. A 3-year-old girl had stepped into a courtroom, observed a police dog named Max, and spontaneously bestowed upon him a name that captured the essence of his heroism, Hero. Social media began to hum with anticipation even before the first official news reports were published. Local journalists shared cautious teases on platforms like Twitter and Instagram. "Tiny witness, huge impact, details coming soon," they wrote, accompanied by subtle glimpses of the courtroom. Viewers, ever eager for stories that combined innocence, courage, and the unexpected, began speculating. What had the girl said? Why had her act captured attention so completely? The curiosity spread like wildfire, and the name Hero began circulating even in these early moments. Within hours, the story reached the front desks of regional news outlets. Headlines varied in tone but maintained a common thread: the astonishing influence of a tiny witness in a serious legal setting. One headline read, "3-year-old names police dog hero in courtroom, melts hearts nationwide," while another opted for simplicity. "Tiny witness, big impact. Courtroom moment captivates community." Even reporters accustomed to hard news found themselves pausing, marveling at the perfect combination of innocence, bravery, and timing that had unfolded in the local courthouse. Television crews arrived at the courthouse, cameras in tow, seeking footage or interviews that could capture the moment's charm and authenticity. Producers debated how best to frame the story without overhyping or distorting it. Would they interview the mother, the officers, detective, Hero? Each option carried potential, yet the journalists were careful to preserve the essence of the narrative. A small child had named a police dog, and in doing so had captured something profoundly human. The law enforcement team, initially caught off guard by the rapid media interest, responded with a mixture of amusement, pride, and logistical concern. Detective, now fully embracing Hero's new identity, allowed a few brief interviews while ensuring that the dog remained calm and focused. The officers, some still processing the emotional weight of the courtroom moment, shared anecdotes of Hero's past feats with reporters, highlighting the dog's bravery, intelligence, and dedication. Every story they told reinforced the appropriateness of the name and underscored the child's perceptive insight. Social media amplified the story at an unprecedented pace. Short clips of the courtroom moment, carefully edited to respect the child's privacy, circulated widely, accumulating thousands of views within hours. Captions emphasized the child's courage, the dog's heroism, and the unplanned charm of the interaction. Memes began to emerge, playful but respectful, celebrating Hero and the toddler's intuitive nomming. Hashtags like Tiny Witness Big Impact, Hero the Dog, and Courtroom Moment trended locally, and soon, the story captured regional and national attention. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Families marveled at the child's bravery and honesty. Dog lovers praised Hero's service and calm demeanor. Law enforcement supporters celebrated the public affirmation of a trained K9's dedication. Comments flooded social media posts. "If only all heroes could be recognized by children," one user wrote. Another reflected, "This story restores my faith in humanity. So simple, so pure, so real." Within hours, local residents who had never visited the courthouse found themselves invested in Hero's story, sharing the videos, photos, and articles with friends and family. Community leaders took note, recognizing the potential of the story to inspire broader engagement with law enforcement initiatives. Officers were invited to schools to discuss K9 training, crime prevention, and the importance of service, and Hero became a symbol of both bravery and approachability. The child's act of nomming the dog, simple as it was, had humanized the profession in a way that official ceremonies and formal press releases rarely accomplished. Parents spoke to their children about courage, empathy, and recognition, often using the toddler's actions as a starting point for conversations about morality, respect, and understanding. Local news stations, seeing the story gain momentum, sent reporters to interview courthouse staff, jurors, and even community members who had been present that day. The emphasis was always on the human dimension, the quiet courage of a 3-year-old girl, the emotional impact on officers, and the symbolism of Hero as a living, breathing example of loyalty and bravery. Each segment aired drew not only viewers but emotional responses. Parents teared up, children giggled at the innocence, and adults nodded in quiet acknowledgement of the significance of this seemingly small act. Meanwhile, Hero adjusted to his newfound fame with the calm dignity only a trained K9 could possess. He remained obedient and focused during interviews, responding to commands with precision, yet the officers noticed subtle changes in the way people treated him. Children approached him carefully, often clutching stuffed animals, and adults instinctively acknowledged his presence with quiet admiration. It was a transformation from an ordinary working dog to a symbol of courage recognized by the public, a recognition catalyzed entirely by a child's perception and honesty. Detective reflected on the evolution of the story. What had started as a courtroom moment now extended into public awareness, community engagement, and social media attention. He realized that Hero's nomming had created a narrative that went beyond the immediate legal case. It wasn't simply about a theft investigation or procedural testimony. It was about humanity, empathy, and the recognition of bravery by those who might see it most clearly, children. The tiny witness, in her quiet observation, had shaped not only the courtroom but the broader public perception of law enforcement's role in the community. As news of the story reached national media outlets, journalists debated the framing. Should they focus on the cuteness of a toddler nomming a dog, the dog's heroic deeds, or the broader social resonance of the moment? Many agreed that the combination of all three elements made the story compelling. Human interest segments highlighted the child's bravery, Hero's achievements, and the interactions between adults and children, emphasizing the rare authenticity of the moment. Television broadcasts included snippets of the courtroom footage, carefully edited to respect the child's privacy, and interviews with detective and the officers illustrated the emotional weight of the event. In schools, libraries, and community centers, the story quickly became a teaching tool. Teachers used Hero's recognition to discuss values such as empathy, courage, and community service. Storytelling sessions included reenactments of the courtroom moment, emphasizing observation, attentiveness, and the importance of recognizing contributions in others. Children were encouraged to reflect on what heroism meant, often referencing the 3-year-old witness as an example of how insight and attention could create meaningful impact, regardless of age or size. Public officials noted the unintended diplomacy of the event. In an era where police-community relations were often contentious, the narrative of Hero and the tiny witness highlighted collaboration, understanding, and emotional connection. The story emphasized the shared humanity underlying law enforcement work, presenting an approachable, relatable narrative that resonated across age groups, cultural backgrounds, and geographic regions. Hero was no longer just a K-9 partner. He had become a community ambassador, symbolizing dedication, bravery, and mutual respect. By the end of the day, the courtroom moment had transformed into a phenomenon. Social media posts, news segments, and community conversations continued to proliferate, all centering on the unexpected heroism of a trained K-9 recognized by the perceptive gaze of a 3-year-old girl. Hero's story became more than a tale of law enforcement success. It became a lesson in observation, courage, and the transformative power of innocence. The nomming of Hero was no longer just a courtroom anecdote. It had entered the public consciousness as a shared symbol of hope, dedication, and emotional resonance. For detective and the officers, the experience was deeply affirming. Their work had always been grounded in service and protection, but this sudden, organic recognition validated both their professional efforts and their personal investment. Hero had performed his duties admirably for years, but it was the toddler's recognition that distilled those years of effort into a single, universally comprehensible concept: heroism. The officers marveled at the simplicity of the act and its profound resonance. As evening approached, the courthouse quieted, but the story of Hero and the tiny witness continued to spread. Messages poured in from across the country, expressing admiration, gratitude, and wonder at the incident. Local law enforcement departments shared the narrative with colleagues, reinforcing morale and inspiring discussions about the emotional dimension of community service. Schools planned field trips and educational sessions, while journalists continued to explore the story's deeper implications, ensuring that Hero's name and the moment of recognition would be remembered far beyond the confines of the courtroom. And so, what had begun as a simple trial involving a K-9 officer and a toddler witness had blossomed into a cultural phenomenon. A child's honest observation had transformed public perception, media coverage, and community engagement. Hero was now more than a dog. He was a symbol, a reminder that courage, loyalty, and recognition often transcend age, circumstance, and expectation. The courtroom may have been the stage, but the world beyond would carry the story forward, inspired by a moment of pure, unfiltered human connection. By the following weekend, the story of Hero and the tiny witness had spread far beyond the courtroom. Social media posts, news segments, and viral videos had sparked widespread fascination, and the local community decided to honor the police dog in a way that reflected both his service and the profound impact of the toddler's act. Plans for a public celebration began quietly at first, coordinated between the police department, city officials, and community leaders. Yet even in the early planning stages, the excitement and anticipation were palpable. The city square, usually a place for farmers' markets and small civic events, was transformed into a stage for heroism. Colorful banners bearing the words "Hero," "Our Community Guardian," were strung between lamp posts, and tables were arranged with informational pamphlets about K-9 units and their vital roles in law enforcement. Families arrived early, children clutching stuffed animals in imitation of Hero's iconic companion bunny, and adults gathered with cameras, notebooks, and notebooks of admiration. There was a shared sense of anticipation. The community was about to celebrate a hero, both four-legged and symbolically immortalized by a 3-year-old girl's act of recognition. Detective and his colleagues arrived, Hero trotting calmly at his side. The K-9 team's preparation was evident. Hero's coat gleamed, his harness polished, and his movements precise. But there was a subtle warmth in the officers' demeanor, reflecting their excitement and pride. They had witnessed the courtroom moment, and now the public would see it too. The officers exchanged quiet smiles, sharing anecdotes of Hero's previous feats in tracking suspects, recovering stolen property, and assisting in search and rescue operations. The crowd gathered, sensing the weight of this celebration extended far beyond ceremonial gestures. It was recognition, validation, and communal appreciation all in one. The toddler, still clutching her stuffed bunny, arrived with her mother, escorted through the crowd with subtle fanfare. Children turned to watch her, recognizing the tiny figure who had so boldly named Hero in the courtroom. Their whispers of admiration spread quickly. "That's the girl. She named Hero." Parents and onlookers marveled at her composure, impressed that a 3-year-old could step into such a public role with quiet confidence and clarity. The little witness's presence, though modest, lent the event authenticity and charm, creating an atmosphere both celebratory and heartfelt. As the ceremony began, the mayor stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. "Today, we honor not just a dog," the mayor began, voice resonating through the square, "but the values Hero represents: courage, loyalty, and the protection of our community. And we celebrate the unique perspective of a young citizen who recognized heroism in its form." The crowd applauded warmly, the energy rising with every acknowledgement of the interplay between innocence and service, child and canine, observation and recognition. Hero, trained for calm composure amidst crowds and chaos, remained poised at Detective's side. His ears twitched at the sounds of applause and murmured admiration, tail flicking occasionally. The crowd's attention oscillated between him and the tiny witness, whose small gestures of encouragement and acknowledgement drew smiles from everyone present. Children reached toward Hero cautiously, parents guiding them to approach with respect, while adults whispered words of praise and recognition. The dog's presence, grounded yet dignified, anchored the celebration, embodying the qualities that had earned him the name Hero in the first place. Detective took a moment to address the audience, recounting some of Hero's most memorable moments in service. "Hero has been part of countless investigations," he explained, "from tracking suspects to assisting in search and rescue missions. But what makes today truly special is that his bravery was recognized in a way we rarely anticipate, by someone so young, so pure, and so observant." The crowd nodded, their admiration deepened by the reminder of Hero's real-world impact and the unique manner in which the community's youngest voice had elevated his presence. The toddler, encouraged by her mother and the warmth of the crowd, stepped forward carefully. With her tiny hand raised slightly toward Hero, she repeated her courtroom words in a gentle, clear voice. "Hero helps everyone." The statement, though simple, resonated across the assembled crowd. Adults exchanged quiet nods, children giggled softly, and officers smiled knowingly, recognizing the profound authenticity behind the declaration. In that moment, The tiny witness had not only reaffirmed her role in naming Hero, but had symbolically linked the community to the values he represented. Local media captured the event with careful precision, focusing on the genuine connection between child and dog. Reporters interviewed detective and members of the K-9 team, who shared heartfelt anecdotes of Hero's contributions, emphasizing his loyalty, intelligence, and courage. Clips of the toddler speaking, pointing to Hero, and observing his reactions were broadcast with emphasis on her composure, bravery, and the innocence that had inspired an entire community. Social media engagement soared as parents shared the videos, spreading the story beyond the city's borders to a nationwide audience. Community members were encouraged to participate actively in the celebration. Children were invited to draw pictures of Hero, write short letters expressing their admiration, and share stories of their own pets or heroes in daily life. Local artists painted murals depicting Hero's exploits and the courtroom moment, creating visual tributes that would last long after the event ended. Teachers and parents highlighted the value of observation, courage, and recognition, using the toddler's actions as a teaching moment for children of all ages. Food vendors and local businesses joined the celebration, providing snacks, refreshments, and hero-themed merchandise. T-shirts with slogans like Hero, named by a tiny witness, and stuffed animals modeled after Hero were quickly snapped up by children and adults alike. The atmosphere was festive yet reverent, a balance between celebration and reflection. The naming of Hero had become a catalyst for communal pride, joy, and appreciation, uniting individuals from diverse backgrounds in recognition of bravery and service. Several community leaders took the opportunity to speak about the broader implications of Hero's service. Officers emphasized the importance of K-9 units, the rigorous training involved, and the daily dedication required for success in law enforcement. Yet the underlying message remained the child's perspective. Heroism, courage, and service could be observed, recognized, and celebrated by anyone, regardless of age. The toddler's naming of Hero had transformed abstract concepts into a tangible, emotionally resonant narrative for all attendees. By mid-afternoon, the celebration had reached its peak. Children paraded around Hero cautiously, patting his coat under the careful supervision of their parents. The tiny witness's mother gently guided her daughter, allowing her to step closer to Hero, who responded with calm attention. Photographers captured the moment, framing the interaction as both a tribute to the dog's service and a testament to the child's courage and insight. Every smile, every gentle touch, every soft word reinforced the communal recognition of bravery and dedication. Local officials announced a formal plaque to commemorate the event and Hero's contributions, citing the courtroom moment as the inspiration for its creation. The plaque would be installed at the police department, visible to officers, visitors, and community members alike. It would immortalize both Hero's deeds and the tiny witness's naming, ensuring that future generations would understand the story behind the name. For the community, the plaque symbolized more than recognition. It represented connection, shared values, and the unexpected ways courage can be acknowledged. Even as the sun began to set, the celebration continued with quiet, heartfelt interactions. Families lingered, officers remained approachable, and Hero, despite his long day, maintained his calm, dignified presence. The toddler, now a local celebrity of sorts, clutched her stuffed bunny, occasionally offering soft words of encouragement to Hero. Adults marveled at the maturity, focus, and bravery of the tiny witness, recognizing that her actions had elevated a routine public service dog event into a communal moment of inspiration. By the evening's conclusion, the community had experienced more than a ceremonial recognition of a police dog. They had witnessed the transformative impact of innocence, observation, and courage. The tiny witness had bridged the gap between the formal, procedural world of law enforcement and the human, emotional world of the community. Hero had become not just a dog, but a symbol, a living reminder that bravery, loyalty, and recognition often arrive from unexpected sources, and that even the smallest voice can resonate across an entire city. As families dispersed, officers shared quiet words among themselves, reflecting on the day's events. Detective, kneeling to pat Hero one last time, whispered, "We'll never forget today, buddy. Not just for you, but for everyone who saw what courage and recognition truly mean." The K9 responded with a gentle, measured wag of his tail, as if acknowledging both his own service and the profound emotional impact of the tiny witness's act. In that shared moment, the law enforcement team, the community, and the child understood something universal. Heroism is more than action. It is recognized, celebrated, and amplified by the empathy and perception of others. And so, the community celebration concluded, leaving behind not only memories, plaques, and photographs, but also a story that would be told for years to come. The story of Hero, the police dog, and the tiny witness whose brave, innocent voice had elevated him to a symbol of courage, loyalty, and community spirit. Months had passed since the courtroom moment that captured the attention of an entire city, and the story of Hero and the tiny witness had grown into something larger than anyone could have anticipated. The narrative had evolved from a brief courtroom anecdote into a symbol of bravery, observation, and community recognition. Schools, local organizations, and media outlets continued to reference the event, emphasizing the values embedded in the act: courage, empathy, and the powerful influence even the smallest voice can exert. Detective, reflecting on the months since the trial, noticed subtle yet profound changes in both Hero and the community. Hero's daily routines remained disciplined and precise, but he carried himself with an added layer of recognition and dignity. Officers would often pause to acknowledge Hero's presence in meetings, training sessions, or public demonstrations, using him as a living example of dedication and service. Hero's calm composure, his intelligence, and the loyalty he had always exhibited were now amplified by the public's awareness of his name, bestowed by the tiny witness. The little girl, now slightly older but still perceptive beyond her years, remained a quietly central figure in the story. Her parents had shielded her from excessive media attention, while allowing her participation in educational and community events related to Hero. She would occasionally accompany her mother and detective to schools, libraries, and community centers where Hero made appearances. Each time, the girl's presence was a reminder that courage and recognition could emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that even a toddler's perspective could inspire and resonate on a broad scale. Local schools integrated Hero's story into lessons about observation, responsibility, and empathy. Teachers shared the courtroom video clips, edited for appropriateness, and encouraged students to discuss how even the smallest actions could have meaningful impacts. Children were asked to reflect on moments when they had recognized kindness or bravery in others, creating a ripple effect of attentiveness and compassion. The tiny witness became a role model, her courage and insight providing a framework for lessons in morality, civic engagement, and social awareness. Hero's impact extended beyond educational initiatives. The police department launched a series of community outreach programs under the banner Heroes Among Us, inspired directly by the courtroom naming. The programs included demonstrations of K9 training, interactive sessions for children to learn about police service, and community patrol initiatives designed to foster trust between officers and residents. Hero was always at the center of these activities, serving as both a practical tool and a symbol of courage, loyalty, and connection. The tiny witness, though still very young, was often present at these events, quietly observing and occasionally participating, reinforcing the story's authenticity. The story of Hero and the tiny witness also captured the attention of national media. Human interest programs and news outlets highlighted the narrative as an example of the intersection between innocence, bravery, and law enforcement dedication. Segments explored Hero's past contributions to the department, emphasizing his intelligence, tracking ability, and calm demeanor under pressure. Yet the central focus remained the toddler's nomming, the simple act that transformed a working dog into a community hero and symbol. Interviews with detective, officers, and the girl's parents reinforced the narrative's emotional depth, demonstrating the enduring power of recognition from unexpected sources. Beyond media coverage, Hero's story inspired tangible contributions to the community. Fundraisers were organized to support K-9 training programs, new equipment for police dogs, and community engagement initiatives. Citizens donated generously, often citing the courtroom moment as their motivation, a recognition that small, authentic gestures of appreciation could ripple outward to create meaningful, lasting impact. The local police department recognized the importance of this public support, incorporating the community's enthusiasm into long-term planning for K-9 programs and outreach initiatives. The courtroom footage, carefully archived and shared with community centers, became a tool for ongoing education. Law enforcement officers used it in training sessions to highlight the human dimension of their work, emphasizing the importance of public perception, community engagement, and empathy. Hero's calm behavior and the child's bravery were repeatedly cited as lessons in observation, communication, and the value of recognition. The simple act of nomming a dog had evolved into a multi-layered narrative, with practical applications for law enforcement training and public education alike. Months later, the city organized a formal recognition ceremony at the police department, attended by local officials, community members, and representatives from schools. A commemorative plaque was unveiled, bearing Hero's name and honoring his contributions to public safety, with a nod to the tiny witness who had bestowed that name. The plaque served as a permanent reminder that heroism is not solely measured in deeds, but also in the recognition and respect of those who observe it. The toddler, dressed in a simple but neat outfit, stepped forward with her mother to touch the plaque gently, her small hand connecting past recognition to present celebration. The crowd applauded warmly, capturing the moment on cameras, phones, and in memory. Hero continued his daily duties with the police department, now carrying not just the routine responsibilities of a K-9 officer, but also the symbolic weight of his name. Citizens recognized him in public spaces, schools invited him for demonstrations, and local news outlets continued occasional coverage of his achievements. Yet despite the attention, Hero remained composed, obedient, and grounded, embodying the quiet dignity and reliability that had inspired the toddler's choice. The officers noted with subtle pride that his demeanor reflected both training and the human recognition he had received, a unique blend that made him a standout presence in the community. The legacy of the tiny witness extended further than public recognition or media coverage. Her courage and insight became embedded in the culture of the city. Parents spoke to their children about her bravery, educators referenced her example in teaching empathy, and officers reflected on the importance of observing and acknowledging acts of courage. The courtroom moment was no longer just an anecdote. It was a lesson in civic responsibility, moral clarity, and the profound impact that observation, recognition, and empathy can create in shaping public values. Hero and the tiny witness also inspired long-term initiatives to strengthen community police relations. Programs were developed to involve children in learning about law enforcement responsibilities, K-9 training, and public safety, with Hero often serving as the living embodiment of these lessons. The child's nomming act was highlighted as an example of respectful engagement, showing that meaningful contributions could come from even the youngest community members. The narrative emphasized the shared responsibility of citizens and officers in fostering trust, understanding, and mutual respect. In addition, the story's viral nature prompted recognition at state and national levels. Hero received formal awards for service and bravery, while the tiny witness was acknowledged in a more symbolic sense for her contribution to public awareness and community spirit. The awards ceremonies highlighted not just Hero's technical skills, but the human connection that had made his story resonate. Officials and community leaders emphasized that true heroism includes acknowledgement, empathy, and shared recognition, values that were in the act of naming Hero. Years later, the story of Hero and the tiny witness continued to inspire. Videos and articles were shared in educational contexts, law enforcement training, and community storytelling events. New generations of officers, children, and citizens were introduced to the narrative, learning the importance of courage, observation, and acknowledgement. Hero himself remained a beloved figure, his presence a constant reminder of the enduring significance of recognition from even the smallest voices. The Toddler's Act had transformed into a lasting lesson for an entire community, that heroism is amplified when seen, named, and celebrated. In quiet moments, Detective reflected on the long-term impact of that day. Hero remained steadfast, loyal, and disciplined, yet the recognition bestowed by a tiny, courageous witness had elevated him beyond the confines of training and duty. The city, the community, and the law enforcement team had all internalized the lesson, that the power of acknowledgement, observation, and empathy is profound, and that even the smallest gestures can ripple outward to create lasting change. Hero's name was not merely symbolic. It was a reminder that courage, loyalty, and recognition are intertwined in the fabric of community life. Ultimately, the legacy of Hero and the tiny witness was not confined to awards, media coverage, or plaques. It existed in every classroom where children discussed bravery, in every community event where Hero's story was shared, and in every interaction between citizens and law enforcement where empathy and observation mattered. The act of naming a dog had become a multi-generational story, illustrating the profound effect that one small, honest voice can have in inspiring recognition, understanding, and shared humanity. And as Hero continued his duties, calm and dignified at Detective's side, the story endured. The courtroom moment, the public celebrations, and the viral media coverage had transformed into a lasting lesson, that heroism is observed, appreciated, and immortalized through the empathy and insight of those who recognize it. The tiny witness had spoken, the dog had responded, and the community had celebrated, a convergence of courage, recognition, and shared humanity that would be remembered for generations.